Welcome back. Today, we're diving into how to defend against one of the most common traps in chess, scholar's mate. It's a quick checkmate attempt aimed at beginners. But with the right moves, you can easily counter it and gain the upper hand. So, it starts with pawn e4, pawn e5, and white bring out his queen to h5. Targeting this pawn right away is critical because white's first objective is to trick you into making a careless move. For instance, if you casually play g6, that would be a catastrophic blunder. Why? Because white can simply play queen e5, attacking both your king and rook, securing a quick victory. Clearly, that's not the path you want to take. Instead, in this position, after white plays queen h5, targeting the pawn, you need to defend it wisely. That's why black responds with knight c6, ensuring the pawn is guarded and white continues the attack with bishop c4, and this time the threat is serious, queen capture f7, delivering a devastating checkmate. For instance, one common mistake black might make here is playing knight f6, attacking the queen. But white simply responds with queen captures f7 pawn, delivering the infamous scholar's mate. Clearly, this is a trap you want to avoid. Instead of falling into it, the correct move is to block the diagonal with g6. At first glance, it seems like this solves the problem entirely. You've stopped scholar's mate, diffused white's premature attack, and secured your position. However, it's not quite that simple. Many players, including some experienced ones, continue playing this variation as white. After black plays g6, white often retreats the queen to queen h3, maintaining an aggressive stance. While it may seem like the immediate threat is gone, white still holds a somewhat active position, keeping the pressure alive. After black defends the pawn to address the real threat of queen capture f7. A move like knight f6 can create long-term weaknesses around the king. These weaknesses become targets, especially after black castles. White can later exploit them by playing moves like d3, followed by bishop g5, and potentially bringing the knight to d5 at the right moment. While these ideas may not be immediate, they demonstrate how white can maintain attacking chances and continue aiming for tactical opportunities, including a potential shot at checkmate down the line. Now, let's see how to punish white for attempting the attack. After you've played knight f6, it's white's move, and they must address your threat of knight d4. From that square, the knight would attack both the queen and the c2 pawn, creating an uncomfortable situation for white. To counter this, white will typically try to control the d4 square, either by playing c3 or knight d2. Let's start with knight d2, which is the better option. This move combines development with control over d4, making it a logical response. What should you do next? Since you already have a pawn on g6, it's a good idea to think ahead about activating your bishop. Positioning it on a strong diagonal will help solidify your kingside defense and prepare for further counterplay. After that, white might play something like d3. Here's where an important detail comes into play. Many players make the mistake of responding with d6, but this isn't ideal. And I'll explain why in a moment. Instead, I recommend that you prioritize castling. By castling, you secure your king and solidify your position. Typically, white will follow up with bg5, aiming to create a pin and apply pressure on your position. If you're unsure how to respond, this can become quite frustrating. My suggestion? React immediately with h6. As soon as white plays bg5, challenge the bishop by pushing h6. If white decides to trade on f6, you have two solid options: trading queens or recapturing with the bishop. Either way, your position remains completely secure, and there's nothing to worry about. But surprisingly, that's not what white usually does. Instead, they often retreat the bishop to bishop h4, trying to maintain the pin. Ironically, this move is a decisive mistake for white. Can you believe that? If you know how to capitalize on it, you're going to crush them. So, what's wrong with bishop h4? It allows you to continue pushing with g5, forcing the bishop back to bishop g3, where it becomes awkwardly stuck. Now, the bishop is completely restricted, and you've successfully expanded on the kingside. Since you're ahead in development, you don't need to worry about the slight weaknesses this creates. White won't be able to exploit them. From here, your plan should be to strike in the center. Following a solid strategic principle, when your opponent attacks on the flank, the best response is often a counterstrike in the center. That's why, once you've developed your pieces and secured your position, your next focus should be on launching a central counterattack. In this position, you can strike in the center with d5. Which is why we avoided playing d6 earlier. By keeping the option of d5 available, you create a strong counterplay. This move attacks white's bishop and the e4 pawn simultaneously, putting white under immediate pressure. At first glance, it might seem like white can simply capture the pawn on d5. And they likely will. However, You can't recapture immediately because the pawn is defended by both white's queen and bishop. But that's not an issue, you've set up a dynamic position where white will have to carefully defend. But here's where you have an interesting intermediate move, bishop g4, attacking white's queen. By inserting this in between move, you force the queen to move. The only square available is queen e3, and now the position is ripe with possibilities. One option is simply to capture the e4 pawn, it's no longer adequately defended. So taking it is perfectly fine. However, there's an even stronger idea, knight d4. This move not only increases your control of the center but also opens it up completely, giving you a significant advantage. Now, you can set your sights on white's king, aiming to take advantage of their underdeveloped position and launch a counterattack. Instead of white trying to checkmate you quickly in the opening, you're flipping the script and aiming to checkmate white instead. White is forced to capture your knight on d4 because it's attacking key squares. If white ignores it, the knight will threaten the c2 and e3 pawns, leaving white with no choice but to take it. After you recapture, you've achieved an interesting position, you've opened up the e-file, setting up for a potential attack. Now, with white's queen under threat, it must move. You play rook e8, forcing the king to move. White doesn't have many options, and the king retreats to king d2. White's position collapses after a brilliant tactical shot, knight e4, delivering a check while simultaneously opening up a discovered attack on the queen. The bishop, now incredibly powerful, targets the queen, and this sequence leads to a winning position. Let's rewind a bit, though, and consider what would happen if white plays king d2, moving the king to safety. At this point, you can unleash a spectacular combination, p2, the specific pawn move you had in mind. When white's king moves to king g1, you strike with knight d7. A move that your opponent will likely overlook. It's nearly impossible to calculate this ahead of time. The beauty of this move is that the queen, oddly enough, is now trapped in the middle of the board. Your knight on d7 takes away critical escape squares, and the queen is now under attack, unable to retreat along its diagonal. The rook controls the file, leaving the queen with no safe squares to move. White is forced to trade the queen for your bishop, and that leads to a winning position for you. That's how you can crush white if you know the right moves. However, here's another trick you need to watch out for. Sometimes, instead of playing queen h5 immediately, white will first play bishop c4, and after you respond with something like knight c6 or bishop c5, white will then play queen h5. What they're hoping for is that you'll instinctively pre-move knight f6 while waiting for white's move. If that happens, once white plays queen h5, likely plays knight f6. They might trick you into falling for scholar's mate again. This strategy can work for a while, especially in bullet. Let's rewind and break it down. The key point here is to avoid rushing your initial moves. After you play g6 and white responds with queen e3, the e5 square comes under attack, so you'll need to defend it. Let's consider what happens if white plays c3 next. This strategy can work for a while, especially in faster formats like bullet. But let's rewind and look at the opening more carefully. The key takeaway is to avoid premature moves. After g6 and queen e3, white attacks the e5 square, so you need to defend it. If white plays c3, which is another common move to control the d4 square, your plan remains unchanged. You continue with the same idea, bishop g7 to solidify your kingside position. When white plays d3, you don't mirror them with d6 because you're preparing to strike with d5 if possible. If that's not feasible, you can settle for d6, but it's important to keep the d5 option open. After that, you castle, and if white plays bg5, you immediately challenge it with h6. If white retreats the bishop, you continue with g5, and you're already gaining a strong position. White might respond with bishop g3, but the plan remains the same. Despite the differences in the position, you'll strike in the center with d5, continuing with your original plan. Even though white controls the center with their pawns, you know that on the next move, you can play bishop g4, attacking the queen. Once the queen moves, you'll have the opportunity to recapture the pawn on d5, regaining control of the position. So, after white takes, you play bishop g4, hitting the queen. After the queen moves, the position starts to resemble a previous variation. In the earlier position, we jumped to knight d4 because there was no pawn on c3, but now we can't do that. However, we can still take a more direct approach with knight capture d5, recapturing the pawn while attacking the queen. The knight may also have the possibility of jumping to f4 in the future, increasing the pressure. White will likely need to take the knight. After we recapture with the queen, it now attacks the g2 pawn, which is something to note. From here, we can continue our attack. The d3 pawn is also weak, and we can either play rook d8 to target it or use bishop f5 to pressure it. In some variations, pushing the f-pawn forward with f5 and f4 is a powerful idea. And if the bishop is locked in, it could be captured later. With these moves, you're in a winning position. Thanks for watching and subscribe the channel.